One of the things that I feel that brings my podcast or connects my podcast with the theme of art and healing is that you start to hear these unknown stories. And when you hear these unknown stories, whether you're Black, white, wherever you're from, you hear those stories and it gives you a greater understanding of the past. So for a couple of things, that you don't repeat the past, and also to help you move forward to make better decisions on how you interact with spaces and places and people, for that matter.
What if this is all just a dream?
My name is K.A. Simpson. I am the host and author of Flipped, the podcast, a podcast about historic Cincinnati places and spaces told 1 week at a time. So a little bit about the podcast and the intention behind this series is to kind of flip the narrative of what we know as history in Cincinnati and put African-American faces in front of those narratives. So kind of looking at a lot of historic spaces and places like Union Terminal, the Taft Museum of Art, the William Howard Taft site, DeVue Park in Northern Kentucky, looking at those historic spaces and talking about the African-American narratives that went in and around those historic spaces and places. One of the things that inspired this podcast, and I'm going to let you on a little secret, I'm a closet historian, so I like history just a little bit, and that was inspired by my mother, who, when I was a kid, she would tell me these stories about these spaces that we would travel around, and they always centered around African-American spaces, but I never heard about those, I never read about those outside of my family. So I wanted to bring those stories and actually look into those stories and bring those stories to life. One of the things that means the most to me as being a grant recipient from ArtsWave for the Truth and Healing grant is that I'm being recognized for what I do as an artist. I think in the past it's been harder as an African-American artist or author to get your stories to the forefront. And I think the grant to this this Truth and Healing grant actually elevates that artistry and hopefully preserves it for the future to come. I think one of the things that I feel that brings my podcast or connects my podcast with the theme of art and healing is that you start to hear these unknown stories. And when you hear these unknown stories, whether you're Black, white, wherever you're from, you hear those stories and it gives you a greater understanding of the past. So for a couple of things, that you don't repeat the past, and also to help you move forward to make better decisions on how you interact with spaces and places and people, for that matter. Through the podcast, I've actually learned a lot of things that I did not know about Cincinnati, and that's what's fun, right? It's discovering those, trying to deliberately look at or find African-American stories in these spaces and places. One of the bigger things that I found out was on one of my first episodes talking about Northern Kentucky's DeVue Park and how the family started out as a milliner in downtown Cincinnati, so a hat maker, and then they went into real estate development, so landlords in the West End in the early 1900s, and that started to pique my interest. I was like, wait a minute, there were Black folk that lived in the West End during the same time. So kind of finding that was just something that sparked my interest. Being from Northern Kentucky, being from Covington, DeVue Park has always been this kind of special place, a great space, and it really is. But it's just interesting to find that little quirk, and it's like, oh, a lot of the money, or some of the money that was made to buy property of DeVue Park was because of the backs of African Americans in the West End. I was really inspired by some of the episodic podcasts that I've heard over, COVID. We weren't doing it. We had a lot of things to explore during COVID, and podcasting was one of those. And I fell in love with several investigative episodic podcasts, and I thought it would be a great forum to kind of expand my artistry. Well, my creative process is all over the place. And it's like every time I get in an interview, they say, well, what's your creative process? Well, it's like a snowflake. It's like sometimes it's this, sometimes it's that. In general, my creative process is that I get all the information that I can, and I formulate a story in my head. And most of that story is dictated by how I want to find out the story and how I actually discovered a lot of the things. With writing, with podcasting, that's the process. With writing, depends on what I'm writing. It's usually, if I'm writing a novel, I just start throwing ideas down on the page and seeing what sticks. And then again, kind of going back to say, well, how do I want to see this story unfold? Sometimes I start at the beginning. Sometimes I start with an idea of how I want it to end. I know it's not an answer that like a lot of people want. It's like, I want a step by step. It's like, I can't help you. This is my process. And I think that's what makes it exciting about being an author for me, is that my process is varied, and each new piece brings a new exciting kind of journey to take. The most fun part about creating Flipped, especially with the kind of creative journey, is doing the research. Like I said, I'm kind of a closet historian. I started my career in libraries, and I was going to be a librarian at one time. Could you imagine? So kind of doing that research and using the tools that I've learned over the past 2 decades of kind of investigating and working in kind of that library space to find things that people don't realize. So like there's still microfilm and microfiche, and they are great tools and resources to use. And I was reintroduced to those during my Flipped journey. So it's about it's roughly about 7 episodes per season. We'll be recording episode 5 today. I'm super excited about that. But I'd like to expand. Right now, it's kind of more Cincinnati centric. I'd like to expand that to Northern Kentucky. You know, I'm a Northern Kentucky boy, so I'd like to expand it to Northern Kentucky as well for the 2nd season. Not to say there aren't any spaces and places in Northern Kentucky that's going to be in this season as well. So I don't want to limit it. There might be 40 seasons. There might be 2. So one of the things that I would like kind of international and national listeners to know about Cincinnati is that it's very unique space in the United States for a couple of different reasons, not only geographical, but also kind of metro-wise. I've been in the military, I've lived in different spaces in the United States, and I always come back not only because of family, but because of the topography, the geography. One thing that I would like people to know, and it's kind of quirky, that when you fly into Cincinnati, you're actually flying into Northern Kentucky. So if people say, well, I flew through Ohio one time in Cincinnati, it's like, not really. You actually never set foot in Ohio. You were always in Northern Kentucky. One thing that I want people to take away from or to remember from my podcast is that history is never really one-sided. It's kind of multifaceted and 3-dimensional. So there is one road of history or one set of history, but in that story, that historic story, there's probably 5 or 6 or 7 different facets of that story that's usually untold. And I would say, try to figure out what are those other untold stories, and that will give you more insight to kind of the mainstream history that you are learning about. So one thing that I love about the podcast is that I do bring that kind of written history, but also the spoken and collective history. That's what I'm bringing to life. And that's the fun part about the podcast, is that you hear these spoken stories that surround the written showcase. And like I said, it's 3-dimensional. There's other perspectives, there's backstories. And I think that's what's really interesting about Flip. Coming up in the episodes, we're going to be looking at the Cox Mansion, which is now the Cincinnati, the Clifton branch of the Cincinnati Public Library, which used to be a home, and I used to actually live in this house. Long story, you're going to hear why I was living in that house now that it's now a library in the podcast. I'll also be looking at the Taft historical site as well. In addition, I'm going to move over to Northern Kentucky and bring kind of the backstory about Margaret Garner, who was a formerly enslaved individual in the 1850s. So those are just a couple of things. And also there was little known fact in Northern Kentucky, there was a huge racetrack, a horse racing industry in Northern Kentucky. So I'll be talking about that as well. So my truth is actually, I wish I could have heard their answers, but my truth is bringing my story alive and my family story alive in Cincinnati. My great-grandmother came to a house in Newport in 1907, lived on the same street until the 80s. So my family grew up on Saratoga Street in Newport, Kentucky. I've traced my family back over 100 years within 1 mile of the Freedom Center. So to elevate my family story and people that look like me, I think that's one of the great things that is being brought about with this truth and healing process. I think it's a model or kind of a beacon for that truth and healing space, and to have, I think, the rated number one museum in the United States, literally a mile away from where I live and where my family was raised. It's like, it blows my mind out of. So I think it's great. There's no other, no more perfect place to have it. Go to flippedpodcast.com and listen to the podcast.